Let's go! It is Falcom time! I think this might actually be my first time making a video on the company as a whole and not just the Trails series. I know I am the Xeno series man, but also the most viewed video on my channel that is still public and actually took effort is a Trails series video, so I think it would be a good idea for me to keep making videos about that series and the company that makes it. This means that if you want more of this, you should probably like, comment, subscribe, and tell me that you want more of this stuff in the comments. I'm always looking forward to expanding my repertoire of content, especially because the only new Xeno content we're likely to get this year is an art book, so I'm not going to have a lot about my main series to talk about in the first place. Since Falcom releases games annually, December tends to be the holy grail for their announcements, as they'll usually reveal the next year's game in December in the lead up to their annual shareholder report. Now, if all they revealed last December was their 2024 title, this wouldn't be a very long video because I do want to keep this one spoiler-free for the Trails series. Thankfully though, both for fans of Falcom games and for my content, in their shareholders report on December 22nd, they teased a total of 10 titles being worked on in-house at Falcom currently, across various stages of development. So we're going to talk about all of them. While all discussion and speculation in this video is from me, I would still like to credit this Noisy Pixel article, link in the description, because I want to use this specific image of a table listing all of the teased and announced projects. Not only because this is an English translation of something that was originally in Japanese, but because the Japanese one, this is directly from the shareholder meeting PowerPoint by the way, looks like this. And this kerning makes me violently angry, so I don't want to have to look at it while editing this video, and I don't want to subject you people to it anymore, so I'm going to use this much nicer looking English version. I would also like to reiterate that these are just the titles Falcom itself is working on, not other developers and publishers making ports or versions of Falcom's games. That means this list is not going to include a lot of localized games, because Falcom's international publishing partners often work on their own ports to various systems in order to make localized versions. One of the least interesting entries on this entire list is the Switch port of Trails Through Daybreak, so we're just going to use this game as an example of what is and isn't a Falcom project, and as such what to and what not to expect from the other entries on the list, while I talk about all the different versions of the game, because there are a lot. The base original version of Daybreak is the PlayStation 4 version, which was released in Japan on September 30th, 2021. The game was also released in traditional Chinese and Korean on the same day, with localization done by Falcom's East Asian publishing partner Clouded Leopard Entertainment. A PS5 version of Daybreak, this also developed by Falcom, launched in all three of those languages on July 28th, 2022. On the exact same day as the PS5 version, a PC version of Daybreak also released. This port was handled not by Falcom, but by Clouded Leopard Entertainment, and only includes their Korean and Chinese localizations. And this is the version of Daybreak that I played through using the fan patch. It's not the only version of the game you'll find on Steam though, as on March 1st, 2023, another PC port of the game, this one only including the original Japanese, also released. This was not developed by Falcom either, but by PH3, and was published by NIS America, who unfortunately remains Falcom's main Western publishing partner. This is actually the English PC port of the game already, it just doesn't have the English patched in yet. As on the same not yet announced day, the English PS4, PS5, and Switch versions come out, this version of the game will also be updated to include the English localization and dub. This all means that if you go on Steam right now, there are actually two different versions of Trails Through Daybreak available. The one actually called Trails Through Daybreak is the PH3 NISA version, the one that will have English text eventually, and the one called Kuro no Kiseki is the Clouded Leopard version. The fan patch actually works with both of these versions of the game, so if you're impatient and want to play it right away in English, you absolutely can. It's the exact same text, just being injected into a different version of the game. I will say the Clouded Leopard version is currently $10 cheaper at full price, and I've seen it go on sale for a lot less, while the NISA version is not likely to be a lot cheaper anytime soon, because it's already $60 and they're probably not going to put it on sale until it's out in English for a while. There's also already a Clouded Leopard port of Daybreak 2 that has a full fan translation patch as well. Now, as for the Switch version of Daybreak, they kind of cheated a little bit, putting it on this list of things they're working on in-house in 2024, because it had very likely gone gold by the time this shareholders report came out in the first place, as a demo had already been on the Japanese eShop for over a week when this came out. The list is also a little bit outdated because it has already come out on February 15th, and Clouded Leopard will be releasing a Chinese and Korean version, this time just a localization, not a second port, on the 29th. There will also be an English version of Switch Daybreak, but it remains to be seen who actually developed that version, because this is the first time Falcom has in-house made a Switch version for a Trails game. That means NISA could just be localizing the Falcom-developed Switch port like they've been doing for PlayStation versions the entire time, or a PH3 Switch port was also made. The jury's still out on that one. I think there might be a PH3 port for Daybreak, but not for East 10, as that was announced a lot later, and the Switch version of that, developed by Falcom, launched the same day as the PlayStation ones. This is probably very confusing, but all I'm saying is that the Switch port of Trails Through Daybreak on this list that's already released in Japanese might be a different port job than the one the official English Switch version will use in the summer. Getting that explanation of what is and isn't a Falcom project is by far the most convoluted thing on the list, so things are going to be a lot smoother for a little bit until we get to the more interesting speculative stuff. We're going to go down from Daybreak Switch and talk about the other two ports, because these are very simple. Unannounced Nintendo Switch title E in development is almost certainly a Switch port for Daybreak 2. There really isn't much that needs to be said here, as Daybreak 2 is following basically the exact same release formula as Daybreak 1, with the only exception that the PS4 and PS5 versions came out the exact same day. There's already a Clouded Leopard PC port. It'll presumably be getting a localization next year. The Switch is a wonderful, wonderful JRPG machine. Falcom themselves seem happy with how well East 10 sold. Daybreak 1's already out on it, and the port seems to be pretty passable. And also, based on other information from later in this list, it seems like, at least in Japanese, Falcom is aiming for the entire series to be playable on Switch, which is pretty great because currently the only platform the entire thing is playable on is PC, and not everyone does that, especially in Japan. As for the last item on the list, unannounced port title F for PS4 and PS5, this is another instance of me being late to actually make a video on this stuff, because the true nature of this project has already been announced. This is a PlayStation port of Ys Memoir, The Oath in Felghana, which will be releasing on May 23rd. Oath in Felghana is the 2005 PSP remake of the original Ys 3, which first came out in 1989. The PSP game was then ported to PC, a 2012 version of which is currently available on Steam, frequently goes on sale for very cheap, and is a fantastic entry point to the Ys series that I can't recommend enough. And then last year, this remake was then remastered in-house by Falcom as Ys Memoir Oath in Felghana, releasing for Switch only on April 27th. I don't really have much else to say about this item on the list then, because it's ports of remasters of a remake, and it seems unlikely that any of these versions are going to get a Western release despite a localized script already existing. Though, it seems like the updated visuals are just higher res portraits and textures, again for a game with the PSP polygonal look going for it, so honestly high res textures might not even look great with it. So you're not really missing out on much unless you don't have a PC, and again, 2005 PSP game, if you can run Steam, you can run the Steam version of Oath in Felghana. With that being said, we are going to bounce to the top of the list, and while there are a few interesting unannounced titles to speculate about, I don't really have a lot to say about most of them. The first is Falcom's entirely new game for 2024, The Legend of Heroes Kai no Kiseki, Farewell O Zamioria, the 13th entry and 20th anniversary celebration for the Trails series. There have only been a few screenshots released so far, and Falcom's president Toshihiro Kondo has said some mildly questionable things about how much of the series' overall plot it will advance through and certain characters that will be included in it that somehow made me only cautiously optimistic for a Calvardark game. But I am going to be brief about all of this. Do not speculate or fearmonger about this. Kai no Kiseki is two things: Trails Through Daybreak 3, and not the final game in the series. The plot tease we've been given so far picks up directly from the end of Daybreak 2. It has already been explicitly mentioned that the Arkride Solutions office is going to be the primary party, with just a lot more returning characters being added in because it's a climactic story event, and because it's an anniversary game celebrating the entire series, and while apparently the completion of the entire main story of the series is jumping from 75 to 90% in only one game, it is still at 90%. There's probably at least one more arc to go, and Kondo stated before Daybreak 1 even came out in Japan that there are going to be at least 3 more arcs in the series, including the Calvard arc, so there's going to be more. You can and should view the title change from Kuro no Kiseki to Kai no Kiseki the same way that the Crossbell arc is Zero and Azure instead of 0 and 02. The only difference here being that there was a Daybreak 2 before the title change. As this is the 20th anniversary game and the climax of the Calvard arc, Kai is a bit more of an event, I guess is the best way to put it, in terms of its effect on the overall series compared to the first 2 Daybreak games. The last quote-unquote event game in Trails was Reverie, which celebrated the first 3 arcs being done, and the first half of the series focusing primarily on Western Zemuria, so we could see some Reverie-like elements in terms of how it touches on every little corner, though in this case it does seem like Calvard is the outright main focus geographically speaking. If you look at the release history of the Trails series, this falls a bit more into place, as there was a year with no new Trails game in between Cold Steel 4 and Reverie, and then the same will be true between Daybreak 2 and Kai. In fact, the only reason Daybreak 2 exists is because they were running behind on development with East 10 and needed a main game for 2022, so it's possible that there was originally not going to be a Trails game in 2022 or 2023, and what was in Daybreak 2 would have been the opening act or some character moments touched on throughout the story of Kai. Because obviously Kai needs to be 2024 because that is the 20th anniversary year of the series. I doubt they'd put it out a year earlier. A rough translation of the title Kai no Kiseki is Trails Beyond Boundaries, which makes sense for a few reasons. Firstly, it's likely that while this is a Calvard arc game, there will be segments that take place outside the borders of the Calvard Republic, as an updated version of the Zemuria map with a few more countries added was released the same time Kondo made a statement about Kai, and the initial plot blurb seems to indicate that the opening of the game is going to take place in Ored State, a country that has not been visited at all yet in the series and has only begun to be fleshed out in the Calvard arc, seemingly in a similar way to how the opening of Azure took place in Calvard an entire decade before Daybreak 1 released. In addition to international borders, the new space travel theme and subtitle Farewell O Zemuria could indicate surpassing boundaries by leaving the atmosphere or visiting other continents or dimensions or things like that. Just because this is subtitled Farewell O Zemuria does not mean that there will never be a return to Zemuria later in the series. Even with the newly expanded map, there's still a lot that needs to be visited, including the Far East, which there are talks about boundary-related things there too in the first 2 Daybreak games, so some of that might be touched on. There are a lot of reasons for this title, in addition to the fact that it just sounds cool as an anniversary, climactic game that all signs have begun to indicate is going to include a massive paradigm shift for the series as a whole, to the same degree as Cold Steel 4 and Reverie combined, if not more. That is all I'm going to say about Kai no Kiseki now, because to talk any more about it would be to spoil the entire first dozen games in the series, which I'm not about to do in a news video. Thus, we move on to the second item on the list, Unannounced Title B, Trails Series, which is in development with no platform or release date. Because we know Kai is going to change a lot of things and we don't know anything about it, this game, which I'm assuming is going to be their main game for 2025, could be literally anything. It could be the start of a new arc. It could be an arcless game similar to Reverie that touches on a region that can't get a full arc but is still relevant to something for the overall series. It could take place in a new world or location outside Zemuria if that's where Kai ends up. Or it could be another spin-off in a different genre like Naruto was. I, however, don't think it's going to be any of that though. I'm pretty sure this is Kai no Kiseki 2. Daybreak 1 is the first Trails game since Crossbell to not be expanded into multiple games. The first half of Cold Steel was supposed to be one game, as was the second half, and even after they split Cold Steel twice, they still had to make Reverie to include things wrapping up stuff from both that arc and Crossbell. Plus, as I said, Falcom's president was like, yeah, in just Kai, the main story will advance 15% in terms of completion, which I do not buy at all. If Kai is multiple games though, I could 100% buy that. Additionally, though some of this might be quirks of translation, there is enough wiggle room in a lot of the promotional dialogue around Kai to suggest that it is only the beginning of the climax of the Calvard arc, and not the entire climax. In terms of work that would need to go into something like this, Falcom is a small company. They can't really make an entire game's worth of assets every single year, which is why you tend to revisit the same locations in every single game in an arc. So even though it's obviously reusing the Daybreak engine, if Kai really is this big climactic game that's including a whole bunch of returning characters that also need to get new models, and is going to a bunch of varied locations outside of just the reused Calvard areas, like Ored State, it seems like the far east, middle east, and far north of Zemuria are all potentially on the table. Also space? Yeah. Even though Daybreak 2 didn't include many new areas overall, and there is an East year in 2023 for them to work on stuff more, I don't know how they're going to cram all of that into one game, especially seeing as how they've failed to cram things they wanted to cram into one game into only one game for more times than they haven't in the past decade of Trail stuff. I could very easily see Daybreak 1 ending with all the fan service stuff having happened, but on a cliffhanger, so that they can focus more on the Arkwide Solutions office, their character development and supporting cast and stuff like that, for a more personal, smaller focused, true finale for the Calvard arc once they're no longer in an anniversary year. Also, Calvard and Erebonia are rivals! It would be weird if the Erebonia arc had 4 games and the Calvard arc only had 3 and was originally planned to only have 2. I could very easily see Kai ending on a cliffhanger with Van or some other group of important characters getting trapped in space, a foreign country or another dimension or something, and Kai 2/Calvard arc 4 being about rescuing them and getting them back, and starting maybe with a small party without any major protagonists in it. Next, we move on to unannounced Title C, which is an action RPG. This could be Ys, but I actually don't think it's Ys. I say that because there's also unannounced Title D, which has absolutely no genre information for it, and I interpreted the list of games here where at least the first few entries are ordered in terms of how much priority is being placed on that specific game, with the additional information that Kondo basically said that talks for the next Ys game started in November 2023. I can't really see Title C being Ys 11 because it would only be behind Kai and the next Trails game in priority, and also somehow above another game in priority, which would be wild, since that would imply that something else had also just started pre-production. Also, if Title C was in the Ys series, they would just say Ys series. Falcom is known for a lot of different action RPG IPs. Ys is just their most popular one. So saying it's an action RPG and not Ys heavily suggests that it is in a different franchise. The main guess seems to be that this is going to be either a sequel or spiritual successor to Falcom's 2015 game, the last game they made that was not Ys or Trails, Tokyo Xanadu, as this is also getting a Switch port with a new localization by Axis Games this year, and there is of course a chance that that Switch version will also get a Japanese back port that includes that text. So if they're doing Tokyo Xanadu stuff in 2024, there could be a new Tokyo Xanadu in 2024 or 2025. There's also the fact that the original game is an action RPG, so that makes sense, and it appears to have been their get newer developers on it to use their ideas for something and try and learn the ropes of developing using Falcom's pipeline and engines and stuff like that. It seems like they've been hiring at least a little bit recently, given their output and more willingness to experiment by doing Switch ports in-house, so that would make sense too. Plus, Kondo stated in an interview with PushSquare.com in July 2023 that Falcom is currently working on a new game, in addition to an article about that interview on the same website saying that there were hints of Tokyo Xanadu getting a follow-up even back then. And there have been rumblings that Falcom has been trying to do a year where they release 2 main games. And it would kind of make sense that if they're doing 2 Trials games back-to-back, whether or not it's Kai and Kai 2 or Kai in a new arc, maybe they can sneak Tokyo Xanadu in there as well, as once again, Daybreak 2 only came out in 2022 because Ys 10 had to be delayed to 2023. We don't know if they needed the entire year's worth of delay, or if they just could not get it out in 2022 and needed part of a year to release in 2023. It's also known that Daybreak 2 only took 8 months to develop, so there's some combination of the extra 4 months of the year spent developing the 2022 game that were not needed for Daybreak 2, the amount of the year spent developing the 2023 game that did not need to be used on East 10, and any new hires they had, as well as people who weren't working on ports at the time to potentially do a Tokyo Xanadu. So we already know Kai is 2024, and it's likely that 2025 will also be a Trails year, so if during one of those years there's also Tokyo Xanadu, and then Ys 11 comes out in 2026, this could actually happen, especially because the action RPGs tend to be shorter games requiring a bit less assets than Trails games, so if they're sneaking an action RPG into a doubleheader of Trails and then coming out with another action RPG after that, there might just be enough wiggle room for them to do 4 games in 3 years. Which would also be pretty cool because it would be the first year since 2012 that Falcom released more than one new game. Lastly on the list, we have 3 title ports for unknown platforms with development suspended. This could only be 2 things. Ports or remasters or remakes of the Gagarv trilogy, the 3 Legend of Heroes games that were in a connected universe that predated the Trails series, or the same but for the Trails in the Sky trilogy. Based on Kondo hinting that he wanted updated versions of the Sky games for at least the past half-decade, and the fact that the Gagarv trilogy is getting a non-Falcom developed, seemingly Korean-only mobile remake this year, heavily suggests it's Trails in the Sky. This would be kind of tragic because, well, development is suspended, but of course suspended does not mean cancelled, and I don't really know why they would be going into remaking Trails in the Sky while they should be focused on getting the Calvard arc finished. My guess would be that this isn't even because of development hell. I'm guessing that recently they were able to get the concept of Sky remakes off of just a to-do list and into proper pre-production, but a combination of having mishandled the transition from PS4 to PS5 so far, the renewed focus on Switch and potential of a Switch 2 coming out that would allow them to use something closer to the PS5 version of the games than the PS4 version of the games on Nintendo hardware, and the possibility of splitting Kai in 2 with also maybe adding a Tokyo Xanadu in the mix, meant that they just had to put them on the back burner for now, because I think what they're going to do is finish Calvard, then have Sky stuff come out before the next arc, either during an Ys year or as a full remake of the Sky trilogy in 2027, because while it seems like an important character that is primarily involved in the Sky arc is coming back in Kai as is, it would make sense for them to try and get remakes or remasters or whatever of the first arc in the series out around the 25th anniversary and before properly launching into endgame arcs. Calvard is a late game arc in terms of the entire series, but it is not an endgame arc, and it seems like Kai is going to be the gateway to that. So they're going to give us a little teaser of the end of things, and then go back to the beginning to get modern versions of the Sky games that people can actually play on things that aren't PCs if they don't have one. And once again, assuming Switch 2 is backwards compatible, a version of Sky that is playable on the Switch 2 at least would make a second platform the entire series is playable on, which I will never complain about. Basically, I wouldn't be worried about us never getting Trails in the Sky remakes. Another potential hang-up in that would be localization rights, because again, that arc was done by not the company who currently publishes Falcom's games in the West, so there would be some working around with that and potentially needing to get the entire series relocalized if they can't work out something with the existing script. There's also the fact that while the Sky games are shorter than most recent Trails games, they are still long RPGs that are longer than, say, an Ys game, so if they're going full remake and not a remaster route like they did with Crossbell recently, it would take longer to develop, probably even than the first game in a new arc would. So we weren't super likely to see a formal announcement of this for at least a couple of years, even if development never was suspended. Like, delay or not, we're probably only getting one new Xenoblade game in between now and whenever this new Sky stuff comes out, just because of the way Falcom operates. But yeah, Falcom is cooking a whole lot, and while some of this stuff won't be localized, and some of the stuff probably won't see the light of day for a long time still, there's a lot to be excited about. While I am a bit cautious about the direction of the Trails series with Kai, there's still 12 games that I like that have already come out, and are absolutely worth getting into. Ys is fantastic. I'm very excited for Ys 10. And there's just a lot of stuff on this list that I'm looking forward to. Well, yeah, some of it might not get localized at all, and a lot of it is just ports of games that already came out. Most of those games are pretty good, so we can't really complain about them being accessible to more people and in a state where they can be played in more modern forms on more modern platforms. But yeah, hopefully I gave you a bit more excitement about Falcom's upcoming releases, and maybe encourage you to check out either Falcom as a company or some of their games that you hadn't been interested in before, because they make a lot of good ones, and I want to share that as much as possible, especially to Xeno fans, because I think you will like Trails a whole lot, and if you like action RPGs, you will like Ys as well. Until next time, though, which will be Riku time, unless we have more Xeno news, this is Luxon, signing off.